He thought this quiet woman would be the easiest person he'd ever humiliate in his courtroom. But by the end of the hearing, even his own voice would betray him. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. Now, back to Sarah Mitchell. The courtroom in downtown Boston carried its usual weight that morning, polished wood gleaming under soft overhead lights, the American flag standing still behind the judge's bench, and rows of spectators whispering in low anticipation as they waited for proceedings to begin. Judge Franklin Pierce sat elevated above them all, his black robe perfectly pressed, his expression carved from years of authority and control, a man who had built his reputation not just on legal knowledge, but on reminding others exactly where they stood beneath him. When the clerk called the next case, a faint shift moved through the room as Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her presence almost invisible at first glance. Dressed in a modest gray cardigan and simple slacks, her posture calm, her hands steady, her expression unreadable. To most people watching, she looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong place, someone unprepared for the sharp edges of a courtroom ruled by a man like Pierce. But Pierce noticed her immediately, and something in his eyes hardened, not with curiosity, but with recognition, the kind that comes when pride has been quietly wounded before. Months earlier, in a public town meeting, Sarah had spoken out, calmly, precisely, challenging one of his rulings with a clarity that lingered long after the room had emptied. And while others had dismissed her as just another concerned citizen, Pierce had not forgotten the way her words had landed. Today was not just another case for him. It was an opportunity. As Sarah reached the defendant's table, a subtle murmur passed through the spectators, some glancing at her outfit, others already anticipating what they assumed would be a brief and unremarkable hearing. The clerk read the charge, a minor administrative violation inflated just enough to require her appearance. And as the final word echoed, Pierce leaned forward slightly, his gaze settling on her like a spotlight. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, his voice smooth but edged with something sharper beneath. "I trust you understand the seriousness of appearing before this court." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the gallery, subtle but unmistakable. Sarah nodded once, her voice calm when she responded, "Yes, Your Honor." But Pierce wasn't finished. Not even close. He adjusted his posture, letting the silence stretch just long enough to draw every eye in the room toward them before continuing. "Because from what I can see, you don't appear to have any legal representation." The pause that followed wasn't empty. It was deliberate, calculated, designed. And as the room leaned into that silence, waiting for her to falter, to hesitate, to reveal uncertainty, Pierce allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile, the kind that never reached his eyes. "Tell me, Ms. Mitchell," he added, his tone now carrying a quiet mockery, "are you planning to handle this yourself?" The question hung in the air like a test no one expected her to pass. And for a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the weight of judgment pressing in from every direction, waiting to see how this simple, quiet woman would respond. But Sarah didn't move right away. She didn't rush to speak. She simply stood there, her eyes steady, her breathing even, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. And in that stillness, something shifted, subtle, almost invisible, but enough to make the room feel just a little different. The kind of silence that comes right before everything changes. The silence lingered just a second longer than expected, stretching thin across the polished courtroom like a wire pulled too tight. And Sarah finally lifted her gaze to meet the judge's eyes without hesitation, her voice calm, measured, and steady as she spoke. "If the court permits, Your Honor, I am prepared to represent myself." A ripple moved through the room, subtle at first, then growing into quiet murmurs that bounced softly against the wooden walls, not loud enough to interrupt proceedings, but enough to reveal what everyone was thinking. This was exactly what they had expected and exactly what they wanted to see. Judge Pierce leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers resting together as if he had just been handed confirmation of something he already believed. "You are prepared," he repeated slowly, as though testing the weight of her words, then allowed a faint chuckle to escape, one that carried just enough volume to invite the room to share in the moment. "Ms. Mitchell, this is a court of law, not a place for experimentation." A few heads in the gallery nodded. Others exchanged knowing looks, and somewhere in the back, someone let out a quiet breath that sounded suspiciously like suppressed laughter. Sarah did not react. She did not lower her eyes or shift her stance. She simply remained still, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, her posture composed in a way that did not belong to someone out of their depth. Pierce noticed it, and for a fraction of a second, something unreadable flickered across his expression before disappearing behind practiced authority. He leaned forward again, his tone sharpening just enough to cut through the room. "Let me make this very clear," he said, each word deliberate. "Individuals who choose to represent themselves often do so at their own disadvantage. The law is not something one simply picks up." The pause that followed was intentional, giving his words time to settle, to echo, to press against her from all sides. "But if you insist," he added, tilting his head slightly, "the court will allow it." The clerk shifted in his seat, glancing briefly at Sarah, as if expecting hesitation, but none came. Instead, she gave a single nod, slow and certain, and something about the simplicity of that gesture caused the murmurs to fade, not completely, but enough to change their tone. It was no longer amusement. It was curiosity. Pierce turned a page in the file before him, though he had clearly memorized every detail long before she entered the room. "You are here today regarding a failure to comply with a prior notice issued by this court," he continued, his voice regaining its formal rhythm, "a matter that has since escalated due to your non-appearance." He looked up again, eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you dispute these charges?" The question landed heavier than it should have for such a minor case, as if it carried something beneath the surface that only he understood. Sarah's fingers moved just slightly, brushing against a folder resting on the table, a simple manila file that seemed almost out of place against the polished courtroom setting. She opened it with quiet precision, the soft sound of paper shifting echoing faintly in the otherwise still room, and for the first time, a few people leaned forward, drawn not by spectacle, but by something harder to name. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice unchanged. "I do." The words were simple, but they did not land like a denial. They landed like the beginning of something. Pierce's gaze sharpened again, his posture tightening almost imperceptibly as if he had expected compliance, not resistance. "On what grounds?" he asked, his tone now edged with something closer to challenge. Sarah did not answer immediately. Instead, she lifted a single sheet of paper from the folder, her movements unhurried, deliberate, and when she finally spoke, there was no hesitation in her voice, no trace of uncertainty, only clarity. "On the grounds," she began softly, "that the notice in question was neither properly issued nor legally binding under the applicable statute." For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. And then, almost as if the room itself had recognized the shift, a hush fell deeper than before, the kind that does not come from anticipation, but from the quiet realization that something had just changed. The words settled into the courtroom with a quiet weight that did not belong to a simple objection, and for the first time that morning, Judge Pierce did not respond immediately, his fingers pausing against the edge of the bench as his eyes fixed on the document in Sarah's hand, measuring, calculating, reassessing. "That is a serious claim, Ms. Mitchell," he said at last, his tone no longer amused, but sharpened with something closer to scrutiny, one that requires more than a vague assertion. A faint shift moved through the gallery, the earlier curiosity now tightening into focused attention, as if the room itself was leaning closer, waiting to see whether she would falter under the weight of his words. But Sarah did not rush. She placed the document gently on the table before her, aligning it with careful precision, then looked up again, her expression unchanged. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady, "which is why I have prepared a response." The phrasing was simple, but the implication was not. A few heads turned, the clerk straightened slightly, and even the court reporter paused for half a second before continuing to type, the rhythm of the room subtly disrupted. Pierce leaned back, studying her now with a different kind of attention, the kind reserved for something that did not behave as expected. "Very well," he said, his voice measured. "Present your argument." The invitation sounded formal, but there was an edge beneath it, a challenge, a quiet expectation that whatever she offered would collapse under its own weight. Sarah lifted the first page, her fingers steady, her movements deliberate, and began, not with hesitation, but with clarity. The notice referenced by the court, she said, was issued under Section 42B of the Municipal Compliance Code. She paused just long enough for the reference to settle, then continued. However, that section applies exclusively to cases involving verified prior infractions within a 12-month period. A faint murmur rippled through the room, small, uncertain, as if the audience was trying to follow something just beyond their understanding. Pierce's expression did not change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Sarah continued, her voice even, unhurried, each word placed with intention. In my case, there were no prior infractions on record at the time the notice was issued, which makes its application inconsistent with the statute as written. The courtroom grew quieter, not because of tension, but because of recognition, the kind that begins as doubt and slowly sharpens into awareness. Pierce shifted in his seat, his hand moving toward the file in front of him, flipping a page, with more force than necessary, as if searching for something that should have already been there. That is a narrow interpretation, he said, his tone firm, but no longer dismissive, and one that overlooks the court's discretion. Sarah inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the point without conceding it. Respectfully, Your Honor, she replied. Judicial discretion does not extend to overriding the explicit conditions outlined in the statute. The words were calm, but they landed with precision, and this time, the reaction in the room was immediate, not loud, not disruptive, but undeniable. Someone shifted in their seat, another leaned forward, and the quiet energy that had once been directed at her began to turn, slowly, almost imperceptibly, toward the bench. Pierce's jaw tightened just slightly, the first visible crack in his composure, and he leaned forward again, his voice carrying a sharper edge. You seem remarkably confident for someone without formal representation, he said, the hint of mockery returning, though it no longer carried the same weight. Sarah did not look away. Confidence is not the issue, Your Honor, she said softly. Accuracy is. And for a moment, no one in the room moved, no one spoke, as the air itself seemed to shift, the balance tilting in a way that no one had expected when the hearing began. The word accuracy did not echo loudly, but it lingered in a way that made the room feel smaller, tighter, as if every person present had suddenly become aware that this was no longer a routine hearing, and Judge Pierce felt it too, though he masked it behind a controlled inhale, his fingers pressing lightly against the polished wood of the bench before he spoke again. Then let us examine your claim of accuracy, he said, his tone measured, but no longer relaxed, as he reached for the file before him and opened it with deliberate precision, scanning the contents with a focus that had not been there moments before. The faint rustle of paper sounded louder than it should have, amplified by the silence that now filled the courtroom, a silence no longer rooted in expectation of her failure, but in uncertainty about what might come next. Sarah remained still, her posture unchanged, her hands resting calmly beside the folder as if she had already said everything she needed to say, and that stillness unsettled him more than any argument could have. According to the record, Pierce continued, his eyes moving quickly across the page. A notice was issued and a response was not received within the required time frame. He looked up, his gaze sharper now. That is a matter of fact. A few subtle nods appeared in the gallery, people clinging to something familiar, something simple, something that made sense. But Sarah did not react to the statement as a challenge. Instead, she reached into her folder again and removed a second document, placing it gently on the table before her. That would be correct, she said, her voice calm, if the notice had been properly delivered. The sentence landed with quiet force, and this time, the shift in the room was immediate. The clerk looked up. The court reporter slowed. Even the faint ambient sounds of the building beyond the courtroom seemed to fade. Pierce's eyes narrowed again, but there was no trace of amusement left. Explain, he said, a single word, but heavier now, edged with something closer to demand than mockery. Sarah lifted the document slightly, just enough for it to be visible, but not displayed, her movements controlled, deliberate. This is the certified mailing record associated with the notice, she said. It indicates that the document was returned to sender due to an address discrepancy. A ripple moved through the room, not loud, but unmistakable, as people shifted in their seats, their attention no longer casual, but fully engaged. Pierce's gaze dropped back to his file, flipping quickly through the pages, his movements sharper now, less controlled, searching for confirmation, for contradiction, for anything that would restore the ground beneath him. "That is a procedural issue," he said after a moment, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty, "not a dismissal of responsibility." Sarah inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without retreating. "Procedural issues determine validity, Your Honor," she replied. Softly, if the notice was not properly delivered, then the obligation to respond was never legally triggered. The words were not raised, not emphasized, but they landed with unmistakable precision, and this time, the reaction was different. There were no murmurs, no quiet laughter, only stillness. The kind that comes when people realize they are watching something unfold that does not fit the script they expected. Pierce leaned back again, slower this time, his eyes fixed on the document in her hand, then on her face, as if trying to reconcile the two. The simple woman he had intended to make an example of no longer fit the role he had assigned her. And for the first time since the hearing began, he did not immediately know what to say. The room held its breath, the air thick with something unspoken, as the balance shifted again, not abruptly, but undeniably. And in that quiet moment, it became clear to everyone present that this was no longer a question of whether she could defend herself. It was a question of how far this would go. The question of how far this would go did not remain unanswered for long, because the moment the silence stretched too far, Judge Pierce straightened in his seat again, as if forcing the courtroom back into order through sheer will, his voice returning with a sharper edge, though the confidence behind it no longer felt unshakable. "Even if there was an issue with delivery," he said, his tone deliberate, controlled, "the court maintains authority to proceed when a matter has been duly recorded and filed." The statement sounded firm, but it carried the faintest trace of strain, the kind that only became noticeable when everything else had grown quiet. Sarah did not interrupt. She did not challenge him mid-sentence. She simply listened, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged, allowing his words to settle fully before responding. "Authority does not replace process, Your Honor," she said softly, and this time, her voice carried just enough weight to shift the air again. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances, the earlier certainty in their expressions now replaced with something closer to unease. Pierce's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. He leaned forward once more, his fingers pressing into the bench as though grounding himself. "You are suggesting," he said slowly, "that this court acted outside its bounds." The implication hung heavy, not just in the words, but in the way they were delivered, as if daring her to repeat it, to push further, to cross a line that would allow him to regain control. But Sarah did not step back. "I am stating," she replied, her tone calm and precise, "that the sequence of actions taken in this case does not align with the procedural requirements defined by law." There was no hesitation, no escalation, just clarity. And that clarity made it impossible to dismiss her. Pierce's eyes narrowed again, but this time, there was no mockery behind them, only calculation. He turned slightly, addressing the clerk without taking his gaze fully off Sarah. "Bring me the original filing record," he said, his voice firm, though quieter now. The clerk moved quickly, retrieving a thicker file from the side desk and placing it before the judge. The sound of it landing carried through the room like a marker, a point of no return. Pierce opened it, scanning page after page, his movements more urgent than before, less composed, as if the answers he expected were no longer guaranteed. Seconds passed, then more. The courtroom remained completely still, no whispers, no shifting, just the faint sound of paper turning and the distant hum of the building beyond the walls. Sarah stood without moving, her presence steady, almost anchored, as if she had already seen this moment long before it arrived. Finally, Pierce stopped turning pages. His hand rested on the file, unmoving, and for a brief moment, his eyes did not lift. When they did, something had changed. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The certainty was gone. "There appears to be an inconsistency," he said, the words measured, but slower now, as though each one required effort. A quiet ripple passed through the room, not of surprise, but of realization. The shift was no longer gradual. It was visible. Sarah did not react with triumph. She did not press forward aggressively. Instead, she spoke with the same calm tone she had maintained from the beginning. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "There is." And in that moment, the balance tipped completely, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with something far more powerful. The truth, laid out plainly, without force, without urgency, without fear. The room did not erupt. It did not need to, because everyone present could feel it. The quiet collapse of an assumption, the unraveling of certainty. And as Judge Pierce sat there, the file still open before him, it became clear that the hearing he had intended to control had already slipped beyond his reach, and there was no simple way to take it back. The realization did not explode into chaos. It settled instead, heavy and undeniable, pressing against every corner of the courtroom until even the smallest movement felt amplified. And Judge Pierce remained still for a moment longer than expected, his hand resting on the open file, as if it could somehow offer him control he no longer fully possessed. Then, slowly, he closed it, the soft thud echoing through the silence like a quiet admission that the direction of this hearing had changed. "Ms. Mitchell," he said at last, his voice measured, but stripped of its earlier edge, "you have presented a procedural argument regarding the validity of the notice." It sounded formal, controlled, but there was something beneath it now, something closer to caution than authority. Sarah stood exactly as she had before, composed, attentive, waiting, not pressing, not interrupting, allowing him to continue. Pierce adjusted slightly in his seat, his gaze shifting briefly toward the clerk, then back to her. "However," he added, his tone tightening again, as if searching for ground to stand on, "procedural discrepancies do not automatically nullify the broader responsibility of compliance." The statement was careful, almost rehearsed, an attempt to reframe the situation, to regain structure where it had begun to slip. But this time, the room did not lean toward him. It waited, and in that waiting, the imbalance became clearer. Sarah inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the point without conceding it. "That would be correct, Your Honor," she said, her voice calm, "if the procedural discrepancy were minor." She paused, just long enough for the distinction to settle, then continued. "But in this case, the discrepancy directly affects jurisdiction." The word landed differently. It carried weight, technical and precise, and it moved through the room with a quiet intensity that drew every eye back to her. Pierce's expression tightened again, more noticeably now, and he leaned forward, his posture no longer relaxed, but engaged, alert. "Explain your reasoning," he said, though the command lacked the earlier confidence it once held. Sarah reached for another document, her movements as steady as before, and placed it beside the others, aligning each page with careful precision, as if every detail mattered, because to her, it did. "Jurisdiction requires proper initiation of process," she said, her tone even, clear, "and proper initiation requires valid notice." She did not raise her voice. She did not rush. Each word came exactly when it needed to, no more, no less. If the notice was never legally delivered, she continued, then the process was never properly initiated. A faint shift moved through the courtroom, not a murmur, not a sound, but a shared awareness, the kind that passes silently from one person to another. Pierce's fingers pressed lightly against the bench again, his eyes moving briefly to the documents before returning to her face. "That is a technical interpretation," he said, though this time, the words felt thinner, less certain. Sarah did not hesitate. "It is the definition, Your Honor," she replied softly. And for a moment, the room seemed to hold itself in place, as if unwilling to disturb what had just been said. The distinction was no longer about argument. It was about foundation, about whether this entire proceeding had the right to exist at all. Pierce leaned back slowly, his posture shifting in a way that no longer suggested control, but reconsideration, and as his gaze moved across the courtroom, taking in the stillness, the attention, the quiet expectation, it became clear that this was no longer a matter he could resolve with authority alone. The structure he had relied on was being examined piece by piece, not attacked, not challenged with force, but revealed, carefully, methodically, until there was nowhere left to hide behind assumption. And in that silence, deeper than any before, one truth began to surface, not spoken, but understood by everyone present. This was no longer about a simple case. It was about whether the man on the bench had misused the very system he was sworn to uphold. And the answer was getting closer with every word she spoke. The air in the courtroom had changed in a way that no one could ignore, not even Judge Pierce. And for the first time since the hearing began, he did not immediately respond, his gaze drifting briefly across the room, as if measuring the weight of what had just been laid before him. The stillness, the attention, the quiet expectation that now pressed in from every direction. Then he turned back to Sarah, his voice slower, more deliberate, no longer carrying the effortless authority it once had. "You are making a significant assertion, Ms. Mitchell," he said, each word chosen carefully. "One that challenges not just this case, but the integrity of the process itself." The statement hung in the air, heavier than anything before it, as if it marked a boundary, a point where this could no longer be dismissed as technical argument. Sarah did not step away from it. She did not soften her position. Instead, she met it with the same calm steadiness that had carried her this far. "The integrity of the process is exactly what I am addressing, Your Honor," she replied quietly. And for a moment, the room seemed to hold that sentence in place, letting it settle, letting it expand. Pierce's fingers tightened slightly against the bench, the movement small, but visible now to those watching closely. He leaned forward again, though this time, it felt less like control and more like necessity. "Then clarify something for the court," he said, his tone firm, but edged with tension. "Are you suggesting that this entire proceeding lacks jurisdiction?" The question was direct, unmistakable, and it carried with it an invitation to retreat, a final opportunity to soften the claim, to step back into safer ground. But Sarah did not hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "That is exactly what I am stating." A silence followed, deeper than any before it, not empty, but full, charged with the quiet understanding that something irreversible had just been spoken aloud. No one shifted. No one whispered. Even the faint sounds from beyond the courtroom walls seemed to disappear. Pierce did not speak right away. His eyes remained on her, searching, not for weakness now, but for certainty, for something he could challenge, something he could dismantle. But there was nothing uncertain in her expression, nothing unsteady in her posture. She was not pushing forward aggressively. She was not trying to win. She was simply standing on something solid, something he could not easily move. He exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that did little to ease the tightening atmosphere, and leaned back once more, his gaze dropping briefly to the documents before him. "On what basis?" he asked, his voice quieter now, though still firm. "Do you believe this court lacks jurisdiction?" The question was precise, focused, and it shifted the weight of the moment back onto her. But this time, it did not feel like a trap. It felt like acknowledgement. Sarah reached for one final document in her folder, her movements unchanged, deliberate, unhurried, as she placed it carefully beside the others. "On the basis," she said, "that the initiating notice was not only improperly delivered, but also incorrectly issued under a statute that does not apply to my case." She paused, allowing the words to settle fully before continuing. "Without a valid initiating action, there is no legal foundation for this proceeding to stand on." The clarity of the statement did not invite debate. It defined the boundaries of it. Pierce's gaze moved from the document to her face once more, and this time, there was no trace of dismissal left, no hint of superiority, only the quiet, growing recognition that the position he had taken at the beginning of this hearing was no longer sustainable. Around the room, the shift was complete. The audience was no longer watching a simple case unfold. They were witnessing a reversal, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, as authority met something it could not easily override. And in that stillness, as every eye remained fixed on the bench, one truth settled quietly into place. The outcome of this hearing was no longer under the control of the man who had once believed it would be. The silence that followed her final statement did not feel like a pause anymore. It felt like a conclusion waiting to be acknowledged, and Judge Pierce sat motionless for a fraction longer than anyone expected, his gaze fixed on the documents before him, as if they might rearrange themselves into something more favorable if given enough time. But they did not. The room remained still, every eye drawn toward the bench, every breath measured, controlled, as the weight of what had just been established settled fully into place. When Pierce finally spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of the sharp edges that had once defined it, yet still holding onto the last threads of authority. "The court will review the materials presented," he said, his tone formal, but slower now, more deliberate, as though each word had to be chosen with care. It was not a dismissal. It was not a denial. It was an acknowledgement, and everyone in the room could feel it. Sarah did not move. She did not interrupt. She simply stood there, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, as if she had anticipated this exact moment from the very beginning. Pierce turned another page in the file. Though his movements had lost their earlier confidence, his focus no longer searching for error in her argument, but for confirmation of it. The faint sound of paper shifting echoed again, but this time it carried a different meaning, not control, but concession. "The record indicates," he continued after a moment, "that the notice was returned prior to confirmed delivery." The words came carefully, as if they could not be rushed, and as they settled into the room, a quiet realization moved through the spectators, not in sound, but in stillness. Pierce paused again, his eyes lifting slowly to meet Sarah's, and for the first time since the hearing began, there was no challenge in his gaze, only recognition. "And the statute cited," he added, his voice even, though noticeably restrained, "does not appear to apply under the conditions outlined in this case." No one reacted outwardly, but the shift was unmistakable. The foundation of the proceeding had been dismantled piece by piece, not through confrontation, but through precision, and now there was nothing left to support it. Pierce leaned back in his chair, his posture no longer commanding, but reflective, as if recalibrating in real time, and the silence that followed was deeper than any before it, not filled with tension, but with resolution. Finally, he spoke again, his voice steady, but different now, no longer elevated above the room, but grounded within it. "Based on the information presented," he said, "this court finds that the initiating process was not properly established." The words were simple, but their impact was absolute. A faint exhale moved through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but shared, as if everyone had been holding their breath without realizing it. Pierce continued, his tone formal, but without resistance. "As a result, this matter cannot proceed under its current standing." There was no argument left, no angle to recover. The decision had already been made the moment the truth became clear. Sarah did not smile. She did not react with relief or triumph. She simply nodded once, acknowledging the outcome with the same quiet composure she had carried from the start. And as the courtroom remained still, absorbing what had just unfolded, it became clear that the reversal was complete, not marked by noise or confrontation, but by something far more powerful. The quiet, undeniable weight of truth, spoken with clarity, and recognized when it could no longer be ignored. The decision did not echo with a gavel strike or dramatic finality, yet its impact lingered far beyond the walls of the courtroom, settling quietly into every person present. And as Judge Pierce finished speaking, he remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his hands resting on the bench, his posture no longer elevated above the room, but grounded within it, as if the weight of what had just occurred required him to sit with it before moving on. The clerk glanced toward him, waiting for the next procedural step, but even that small motion felt different now, less automatic, more aware. "This matter is dismissed," Pierce said finally, his voice steady, but stripped of the tone that once carried unquestioned authority. It was not defeat in the way people often imagine. It was something quieter, recognition. Around the room, people began to shift slowly, not with the usual casual movement that follows the end of a hearing, but with a kind of careful awareness, as if they were leaving something more significant than they had expected to witness. Sarah did not move right away. She stood still for a moment, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, her eyes calm, her expression unchanged. There was no visible relief, no satisfaction, no trace of triumph, only stillness. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible breath, she gathered her documents, aligning each page with the same quiet precision she had shown throughout, and closed the folder without haste. The simple sound of it shutting carried softly through the room, a quiet conclusion to something far larger than the case itself. As she turned to leave, a few people in the gallery watched her more closely than before, their earlier assumptions replaced with something else, something harder to name, respect perhaps, or recognition, or simply the awareness that they had been wrong. She walked toward the aisle without looking back, her steps measured, unhurried, her presence as understated as it had been when she first entered, yet somehow entirely different. Behind her, Judge Pierce remained seated, his gaze following the space she had just occupied rather than her movement, as if the absence she left behind carried more weight than her presence ever had. The courtroom did not return immediately to its usual rhythm. There was no quick reset, no immediate shift to the next case. Instead, there was a pause, subtle but unmistakable, as though the room itself needed a moment to recalibrate, to absorb what had just unfolded. The man who had once controlled every word spoken within those walls now sat in a silence he did not command, and for the first time, that silence did not belong to him. Sarah reached the doors at the back of the courtroom and paused briefly, not out of hesitation, but as if acknowledging something unseen, something internal, before stepping forward and pushing them open. The light from the hallway spilled in softly, outlining her figure for just a second before she disappeared beyond it, leaving the courtroom behind. And in that quiet moment, as the doors closed and the room settled once more, one truth remained, not spoken, not written, but understood by everyone who had witnessed it. Power may command attention, but it is precision, patience, and truth that define it. And that day, in a room built on authority, it was not authority that prevailed.